Hello and welcome back to Solomon's Cave. We have now reached the fifth and final book of the Pentateuch, Deuteronomy. Now the title of Deuteronomy is a bit of a tongue twister, and it is perhaps the strangest of all the books in the Bible. So let's start our investigation here. As usual, the Hebrew title first, Ele Hadevarim, which means these are the words. Now the people who were in charge of picking the titles may have been in a bit of a pickle here. Because just like Exodus, the first word is these, which may be an additional reason why both Exodus and Deuteronomy opted for including the second word in the title as well. Additionally, we saw that Numbers' first word was Vaidaber, which means he spoke. And that word actually comes from the same root as the word words, which might be an additional reason why Numbers also opted for the fifth word. The ancient Greek translation decided to go for a completely different name, namely Deuteronomion. The similarity with Deuteronomy seems clear, but what does it mean? Well, the first part, Deutero, means second, as in first, second, third, etc. And the second part, Nomion, comes from the word nomos, which means law. So together this forms second law. But it can perhaps best be understood as repetition of the law, which makes more sense since the book Deuteronomy repeats many of the laws that are also found in Exodus, Leviticus and Numbers. Moving on to structure. This is actually one of the most interesting books regarding structure. Now the basic structure is relatively clear. Namely, there are three major speeches given by Moses. Chapters 1 through 4 are the first speech, then 5 through 28 the second speech, 29 and 30 the third speech, and then an epilogue. However, the topics discussed in the various chapters could easily lead to a conclusion that it is nothing but a jumbled mess. So theologians have suggested a variety of reasons for why Deuteronomy looks the way it does. Perhaps there is a deep numerical structure hidden beneath the text. Or perhaps it was a much smaller book to start with, but then later generations of scribes added completely random chapters in arbitrary places. But over the past couple of decades, a new theory began to emerge. Quite literally, you might say, as it was a theory that was inspired by ancient documents that archaeologists were beginning to find and decipher. These ancient documents are collectively called the Suzerain Vassal Treaties. And it is especially the Hittite treaties that are interesting. Wait, no, they were not written on papyrus. Ancient treaties were written on tablets of clay or bronze. Ah, that's better. These kinds of treaties were commonly drafted between two kings, after one powerful king had defeated a smaller king in battle, and the smaller king would become a vassal of the bigger king. So what did a standard contract look like for the ancient Hittites? Well, first you start with a short preamble or title. For example, the words of Tabara, Tatalia, great king, king of the land Hatti, a hero. Or, these are the words that Moses spoke. A second part is a historical prologue that summarizes the events that led up to this treaty. One Hittite treaty starts this historical prologue as follows. In the past, the land of Amuru had not been defeated by the force of arms of the land of Hatti. And it goes on to detail what happened more recently. And in Deuteronomy, there is a pretty long historical prologue, which includes, then we set out from Horeb and went through all the great and terrifying wilderness that you saw. The third part is stipulations, or laws. Usually first a general overview of them, followed by more detailed instructions and regulations later. One interesting similarity here is the following phrase from a Hittite treaty. You shall not desire another overlord for yourself. Which can of course be compared to this command from Deuteronomy. You shall have no other gods before me. Fourth, the calling of witnesses. In the Hittite treaties, that is usually a number of gods, both from the conqueror and the conquered. Like the standard formula, behold, let the 1,000 gods stand by for this oath. In the book of Deuteronomy, there are different witnesses called, including this book, meaning the book of Deuteronomy, a song that the Israelites were supposed to sing, but perhaps most interestingly, heaven and earth are called as witnesses. And then finally, there are blessings and curses. In Hittite treaties, they usually start with the curses, followed by the blessings. For example, this one. If Dupi Tesup does not keep this treaty, then let these oath gods destroy him. But if he observes this treaty, let these oath gods protect him. In Deuteronomy, the blessings come first. If you faithfully obey, all these blessings shall come upon you, followed by the curses. But if you will not obey, then all these curses shall come upon you. So what does a careful comparison between these different treaties on the one hand and Deuteronomy on the other hand show us? Well, first of all, we should note that all important elements are shared. The details obviously differ, but it is relatively easy to find parallels between these two texts. Secondly, they are roughly in the same order. Two differences I spotted between the Hittite treaties and Deuteronomy were the fact that the Hittites start with the curses and end with the blessings, while in Deuteronomy it is the other way around. And the fact that in the Hittite treaties, the calling of witnesses happens all at once, like there's a separate paragraph for it, while Deuteronomy calls on witnesses at various places in the text. Another obvious difference that somewhat obscures the similarities is the fact that Deuteronomy is much longer than the average treaty. Yet the most interesting part is that we have treaties from several nations, and also from several different time periods. And the closest parallels, especially from a structural point of view, are the treaties from between 1400 and 1200 BC. To me, this suggests the following. First of all, though the book of Deuteronomy initially appears to be a random patchwork, there is a clear logic to it. A logic that can bring extra meaning and significance to the individual chapters and paragraphs. Secondly, Deuteronomy is therefore also a united book, and not a book where scribes over the centuries randomly added and changed chapters to fit their personal theology. But from the beginning, the book of Deuteronomy had a clear macro structure, and later scribes did not change this. And finally, to me it suggests that this book is indeed from the time of the Exodus. Most theologians think that the Exodus is said to have taken place either at about 1450 to 1400 BC, or around 1250 to 1200 BC. And the book of Deuteronomy fit precisely with the structure of the vassal treaties from that very same time period. Then the next question is, what does this mean theologically? Well, obviously in this comparison, God is the great king and Israel is the vassal kingdom. Does that mean that God somehow conquered Israel? In a way, yes. So let me explain. Okay, so in the book of Numbers, we saw that when Israel was about to enter the land, they faltered and disobeyed God. As a punishment, God forced them to wander around in the desert for about 40 years, until the old generation had died and a whole new generation had taken its place. This kind of feels like God has declared war on Israel, no? And now Israel was about to enter the land again, and the book of Numbers ends on the cliffhanger. Will they or won't they? But Deuteronomy doesn't answer that question, but instead answers a different question. Namely, is God still at war with Israel? And the book of Deuteronomy as a whole emphatically says no. There is now peace between Israel and its God. The war is over, and this is the formal peace treaty, summarizing the history, repeating the laws and regulations that will govern the relationship, mentioning witnesses, and explaining the consequences for obedience and disobedience. A formal peace treaty in a language the Israelites from that time would understand. So now that we know that Deuteronomy is essentially a peace treaty, what is in the peace treaty? Or perhaps more interestingly, what is different, or what is emphasized if you compare this treaty with the covenant that is described in Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers? First of all, there is an extra emphasis on love. In Leviticus, the command was to love your neighbor. This is repeated in Deuteronomy. But for the first time there is also a command to love God that is repeated several times, while at the same time it is stated frequently and emphatically that God loves Israel. And with love comes exclusivity. So Israel was supposed to worship only one God. Then Israel was also given one land, and within that one land, one God would appoint one place where he was going to be worshipped. And they were supposed to follow one law regarding how to worship God. And there was one tribe that was allowed to perform the rituals. And if they wanted to, Israel was allowed to elect one king. So in that sense, the number 1 is very important for the book of Deuteronomy. Another thing that is somewhat new is that God is given new titles. This sounds like a rather mundane thing, but it is actually very important for theology. Because quite literally, theology means talking about God. And Deuteronomy gives us new ways to talk about God. First, God is a sovereign king. This is largely based on the form and structure of the book, since God is now the great king. Secondly, God is a liberator. This was already clear from Exodus, where God liberated Israel from slavery, but this point is repeated and emphasized in Deuteronomy as well. Third, God is a peacemaker. He cares about peace and strives for peace with Israel and with the world. Fourth, this implies that God can also be at war and is a warrior, specifically a warrior who conquered Israel and who will conquer Canaan, and implicitly one who may conquer Israel again if they choose to disobey God. And fifth, God is a giver. He gives the land to Israel. He gives them a place to worship. He gives them the blessings if they obey, and most importantly, he gives them peace with himself. All of this made Deuteronomy one of the most influential books in history. The vision of Deuteronomy, more than any other book, was a major influence on how later scribes would record the history of the people of Israel, and measuring the moral character of their leaders. Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings make so many implicit and explicit references to Deuteronomy that they are often collectively called the Deuteronomistic history. Also, many of the prophets, including Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, the so-called major prophets, draw their spiritual insight and their vocabulary from Deuteronomy. And finally, Deuteronomy is the third most quoted book in the New Testament as well. After the Psalms and Isaiah, no book from the Hebrew Bible had more influence on early Christianity than this one. And that is where we will be going next in this series, the New Testament. I will be going through the 4 Gospels and the book of Acts, and give you my analysis of them. If you want to see those, you can subscribe to my channel, and you can follow me on social media to stay up to date with news and announcements.